This is a webinar about the new medical device regulations, and it's in relation to loan stores and other community settings. Just a quick disclaimer to start off with. This is only covering one particular aspect of the MDR, so it's not covering a full review of the regulation. I'm not a qualified compliance practitioner, and this presentation is really just aimed at raising awareness, and you should always seek professional advice on topics such as these. So let's dive into it. So where does this apply? So this applies across the EU, which of course covers the Republic of Ireland, but it also applies to Northern Ireland, because the medical device regulation border is being drawn in the Irish Sea and not on the Irish land. And this will therefore not apply to England, Wales and Scotland at the moment, although it's worth noting that it's likely that this regulation will become British law at some point in the future in some form, so it will probably become relevant, and we'll keep you updated on that. So this is a legal regulation, and that means it's not optional, and of course there's all kinds of examples of where companies large and small end up falling foul of the law by not complying. In our industry, obviously Invacare had a particular run-in with the FDA in America, and we're all aware of Volkswagen's run-in with the regulatory authorities around the Dieselgate situation that they had, just to give a couple of examples. And remember that commercial concerns are not valid excuses for non-compliance, in that you cannot say I can't afford to comply. If you can't afford to comply, it means you can't afford to be in business, or you can't afford to provide your service. And also negligence is no defence either. So the regulation, this particular one, comes into play on the 26th of May 2021. It was actually due the same date but in 2020, but due to the pandemic things got moved back 1 year. So why is it important now? Well, it's the change of regulation that's important. So we used to have the Medical Device Directive, the MDD, and that's been replaced by the Medical Device Regulation, the MDR. And these regulations dictate what is a medical device and what needs to be done by manufacturers and other stakeholders in the supply chain, particularly around claims and documentation for medical devices. And loan stores need to be particularly aware of this now, because where in the past cleaning and disinfection wasn't covered so clearly under the MDD, it is very clearly covered now under the MDR. And of course loan stores and other care settings are decontaminating in various ways medical devices, and therefore this does apply very clearly. So what has changed with the MDR? As I just alluded to, under the MDD, disinfection and sterilisation of medical devices was covered to an extent. Cleaning certainly wasn't, but there was certainly some grey areas, which meant that a lot of equipment being used at the moment in loan stores is not classified as medical devices, but will be from May onwards. So things such as automated washer disinfectors, steam cleaners, manually operated washers, detergents, disinfectants, or room foggers being used to disinfect medical devices, they're all going to become medical devices in and of themselves. And that's important because there's a whole regulatory framework that they have to fall into to be able to be placed on the market for those purposes. So how is a medical device defined? Well, in the regulations there's some very clear definition text, and you can access all of this. It's all free to download. You just need to search on Google for the MDR and you'll find the appropriate PDFs. In the main definition here, there's one way of looking at it, which is around the prevention of disease. That's pretty clear, and as I mentioned earlier, in the new medical device regulation they've made it even more clear. And again, I pulled out the text. So any device that is specifically intended for the cleaning, disinfection or sterilisation of devices is in and of itself a medical device. And the most critical thing to understand here is that this all depends on what a manufacturer claims, and we'll come back to that point later in the presentation. Class is important, so medical devices are not all the same. There are four broad classes based on risk. From 1, you've got 2, A and B and 3. The vast majority of the equipment that goes through a loan store is class 1. but actually when we look at the disinfection equipment, that's class 2A, but the other classes are not particularly important for loan stores to be worried about. So just as an example, when we're looking at decontamination processes, detergents would come under class 1 because they are just cleaning, whereas disinfectants and the actual chemicals would come under class 2A. A washer disinfector would also be 2A because it is doing disinfection, and just a pure washer would be a class 1 product. So how do you identify whether something is a medical device? Well, the CE mark is the identification for this, but bear in mind CE marks are applied to various different devices based on different safety regulations. So for example, if you pick up a toy, it will have a CE mark on it because there are safety regulations for toys. Likewise, all electrical devices have safety regulations. So just because something has a CE mark on it doesn't necessarily mean it is a medical device in of itself. To be able to identify whether it's a medical device or not, the best place to look is the declaration of conformity, which the seller should be able to provide to you. There it will be clearly stated, and in the future labels are going to have the MD symbol that we've got up on the screen here on the label as well. So keep an eye out for that, but the best thing to do is to always ask your seller for the declaration of conformity. Devices that are 2A and above, you'll be able to identify this by the fact that they have 4 numbers underneath the CE mark, and these are the registration numbers for the notified bodies, which are the organisations which look over the accreditation to make sure that everything's correct. Moving on, so what should you do now with this information? So we've got a few pieces of guidance here about what we think you ought to be doing. So the first thing to do is to really assess and record your assessment of your current situation. So you want to identify, are you cleaning and disinfecting medical devices? If you're not, you don't need to do anything else. And also, are the machines and chemicals that you're using, are they already classified as medical devices under the MDR? If they already are, again, you don't need to do anything further. And also, if you're procuring new decontamination equipment right at the moment, it would be very important to get these requirements into your specification or your tenders, whatever you're using, to make sure that you're not going to end up procuring something that immediately becomes non-compliant by the time you purchase it. Just as a quick reality check, at the end of the day, I think most loan stores probably don't have machines and chemicals that are medically CE marked. That's probably the reality of it, and pretty much all of the equipment that you're reprocessing is medical devices as well. So I think in reality all loan stores are going to have to do something about this. But it's also, the reality is that it's very difficult to get funding in such a short space of time if you have to change your processes and your equipment. So what are you supposed to do about that? Well, the best thing we think you can do is create a roadmap to compliance. So that's really to say, where am I now? That's part of your current assessment, and where do I need to get to? And so you've got an end point of being fully compliant in the future, but you also need to look at what you can do in the short term to reduce risks. And we'll have a look at a few ideas we have about how you might be able to do that. So creating the roadmap obviously is to get to a fully compliant equipment and processes. The timescale is probably dictated by the time it takes you to get the funding lined up, so maybe a year or 2 is reasonable, but I don't think it would be considered reasonable for places to put a 10-year timeline on this just to push it out down the road. You really need to work on this diligently to make it happen. And what can you do now to reduce risks? So there's a couple of ideas here. So whilst it may be very difficult to procure a new washer disinfector, let's say, it's a large piece of equipment, requires considerable amount of money, you may actually be able to put compliant chemicals in your existing equipment. That would at least be one step better than using non-compliant chemicals in a non-compliant machine. Likewise, you could validate your equipment to current standards, so as if they were new, because it may well be that the machines actually perform at the level required, they just don't have the certification for that, and you could get around that by doing some of the certification yourself. So the standards that are relevant for this are ISO 15883 Parts 1, and if you're using thermal disinfection, Part 6, and if you're using chemical disinfection, Part 7. So those standards dictate what those machines need to do and the testing required for those machines. On top of that, you could also introduce periodic testing and validation. So you're basically identifying the risk that my machine might not be particularly compliant or at the highest level, but if I test it regularly and make sure that it meets the requirements of what a new machine would need to meet, then I can have reasonable confidence that I've actually got a robust process. So who can help you with this? I mean, obviously we at BES Healthcare, we want to be able to help you with this, and we provide no obligation audits free of charge to our customers and to potential new customers. If you want perhaps a slightly more impartial approach, the best thing we think you can do is to look for an authorised engineer for decontamination. So these are present across the UK. It's maybe not so relevant for Southern Ireland, however I'm sure a lot of the AEDs would be happy to come over and assist you. So they're all independent consultants, they're all accredited through IHEM, and on IHEM's website you can find the register of them with all their contact details, so you can find one that's closest to you or contact a number of them and see what services they can provide. But as a neutral third party, they're probably your best approach for being able to get impartial advice on how to comply. So will compliance cost more? Well, short of it is probably yes. I mean, it is expensive from a manufacturer's point of view to produce, whether it's a disinfectant, a machine, a detergent that is compliant requires a lot more testing, a lot more quality control, a lot more rigour generally in the development and manufacturing process, and that all costs money. And so there's no way of avoiding that, and we as BES have been evaluating some of the products that we offer, and we can definitely say, regardless of how much margin people put on it, it is more expensive to offer this kind of equipment. So you need to build that into your budgets. The quicker you make people aware of that in your organisation and the better you plan for it, the easier it will be to comply. So as I mentioned earlier, claims by manufacturers are really important and can't be ignored. So there's a lot of equipment and chemicals out there which are marked as generic surface cleaners or disinfectors, or maybe industrial washers. And these are fine to be used on non-medical devices. I mean, they're not making any medical claims, so you're absolutely fine with that. So something like a standard bed frame that may not be a medical device, or generic touch points around your workplace or work surfaces, these are fine to be cleaned and disinfected using these kinds of things. However, these must not be used on medical devices, even if you feel they're safe to do so, or you have been doing in the past, because they have not been tested and accredited to be able to do that. And you've got to be careful about manufacturer claims. There are some maybe slightly more unscrupulous manufacturers out there who will give you a nod, wink, wink, yeah, you can do whatever you want with this, it's no problem. But that won't stand up to scrutiny if anyone came and audited your process. You really need those manufacturer claims to be documented in writing. And so if you're going to use it on a medical device, you want it to be CE marked and to see that declaration of conformity to know that this thing can be used for that. Now, it may be the case that there aren't actually any compliant products available in a given area. So what are you supposed to do about that? So we think the best thing you can do is to perform risk assessments and try and mitigate risks as best you can. So the first thing is to perform extensive research and make sure there really isn't a compliant option available for you. It's no good just saying the first product I looked at is non-compliant. You need to document that you've looked at a number of options and you haven't been able to find a compliant option. Then you need to assess what's the best alternative. Are there other standards or other regulations that other products are complying to which do give some level of assurance around safety? And then what other measures can you put in place to mitigate risks that could be associated with using a non-compliant product? So there are steps that you could take to try and mitigate this risk and still use non-compliant machines, but you do need to make a particular effort in this area. Just as a particular aside, another important thing for loan stores to be aware of is that they will become defined as distributors under the medical device regulation, and with that comes some new responsibilities that they didn't previously have. So you're going to need to verify the following things. First of all, that the device is CE marked, that there is a EU declaration of conformity drawn up and that you have it, Labelled in accordance with the MDR, so there's a whole bunch of requirements there, and you need to make sure that the labels on the products conform with that. You need to make sure that the instructions for use, the IFUs, are present with the product when you get it, and also when you send it on to end users. And on the device packaging, in addition to the above, you need to have the importer's name, their registered trade name if that's different, also their place of business, and also you need to make sure that the manufacturer's label is not obstructed with anything. A big thing that's coming in with MDR is UDI, which is Unique Device Identification. This is, can be seen as its barcoding. It's around the identification of the device when it was manufactured, batch numbering, and so on. So you need to identify that that is in place. You also need to make sure that the storage and transportation requirements of the manufacturer are met. So for a lot of things this may be pretty easy, but you can imagine, for instance, for a disinfectant, which is maybe a more sensitive chemical, that has certain temperature requirements for storage, for example, that those have been met. And also that the manufacturer maintains and applies a complaint system. So you need to look up the supply chain to make sure that's in place. So what's next? So you need to check whether your decontamination is already classified as a medical device or not, but as I said earlier, I imagine that most loan stores and similar settings probably don't have this, and if not, you can contact us to come and support you to create a roadmap. You can contact an AED, and I'm sure they would be more than happy to help you work towards compliance. And you need to make others in your organisation aware, so more senior management, the finance departments, that they're going to need to budget for this stuff to come through. You can't ignore it. It really is important, and remember, this all comes down to patient safety and our duty of care to our patients. So if you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with BES Healthcare. We're more than happy to help in any way that we can. And here are some more useful links. If you want some more impartial advice, people like the MHRA have an email line where you can ask questions. You can contact IHEM directly. We've also linked here the government guidance on medical devices, which is also a useful impartial place to go and look. And as I mentioned earlier, the register of AEDs is available online as well. And of course, on our website we also have various articles and pieces that we're writing to help cover this topic and provide information out into the market. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful, and if you are a Great Britain loan store, you need to think about the Medical Device Directive, which will remain in force in the UK, which also does cover things like disinfection, but maybe not to quite the same extent. Thank you very much for your time.